Hi, it's Alexander Russo from The Grade. This is the Education Show, and what a day. We've got Cory Turner from NPR here to talk today. Cory, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Alexander.
For people who don't know, and I can't imagine that there anyone who doesn't, but for people who might not know who you are and what you do, can you give us the three-sentence version?
I have been a correspondent with NPR's education team for, well, I guess it's been about 12 years now. And I've been at NPR for 21. One of the strange things about me on the education team is I tend to cover lots of different things. So we're here today to talk about student loans and student loan relief. I also cover K-12 issues. I love doing early childhood. And I've also been doing a lot of education department coverage. And that's been true for at least four administrations. So.
Before we jump into the student loan relief stories, your coverage, and the policy issue, can you give us a little bit of a April 2026 take on what's hot at NPR in education right now? What you have been working on, what you're going to be working on?
So we just released a really big story, and by big, I just mean the effort it required, of mine that I've been working on since February. I went to Iowa, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to sit down with a whole lot of families and school leaders and do a deep dive into the state's multiple overlapping school choice policies and to really figure out, okay, who are these policies helping? How do they work? And are there kids and or families who aren't able to use them or aren't able to benefit from them in the same way?
Right.
And what does that mean? Especially given these days, 2026, I feel like so many states right now have sort of gone all in on school choice. And we've got the big tax credit scholarship program, the Republican federal tax credit kicking in next year that will also help expand access to private schools. So we should be talking about it.
Right. I read somewhere that it's 1.5 million kids and $1 billion already, even before we get to 2026, which isn't nothing.
It's not, do you mean like nationwide or what?
Yeah, nationwide. That's the number I keep hearing from the private school choice people in terms of, I mean, it'll be much larger in 2026. And like you said, it'll be even larger in 2027.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even look at it from the, hey, this is a huge thing or a huge problem necessarily. Like, the thing that interested me about Cedar Rapids was the idea that the state had said, if you want to attend a private school, we will give you roughly $8,000 of funding to do that. And they made it available to any child in the state, regardless of family income. And then that $8,000 essentially left the public school. And that's just a really interesting mechanism for me. And it's just worth studying. Okay, so what does that mean? How many private school doors does $8,000 actually open? What happened in Iowa when the state essentially gave every private school student in the state $8,000? I mean, interesting. One thing that happened is, on average, private schools raised their tuition over the previous 3 years by about 40%.
Right.
And in that way, it's so interesting. Republican lawmakers essentially created a kind of machinery that I know a lot of Republicans have faulted Democrats in terms of student loan policy. Like, the more generous we get in student loan policy, the more quickly colleges are going to raise their prices.
Right.
Whether or not that's true, like, that's the argument. It's very familiar.
Just so we can head off the letters and emails and DMs that we might get, does the $8,000 go directly from the school district to the family or the private school, or what's the mechanism there?
It totally depends. Because the program is universal, any child can get it. And we know that actually the majority of kids who are using it have never been in a public school. So
Right.
that's obviously not money that's leaving a public school. It's not necessarily hurting the public school. What it is doing, and this isn't, I don't think this is an inherently bad thing or an inherently good thing. It's a political choice, but it is essentially putting the state, and I believe it's coming out of its general fund, on the hook for a new stream of funding going directly from the state into the state's private schools, which this year I believe was around $315 million. So that's a political choice that I think voters in Iowa and lawmakers have to decide: is this what we want?
On the hook. I like that. I've heard a story over the weekend. I saw a digital story. Are you done with Cedar Rapids and Choice for now, or is there going to be a podcast series or anything else?
So the reason I did this now and this way is because NPR has this really special program. It's called the Sunday Story. And it's a rare opportunity for an audio reporter like me. And yes, I do digital stories for just about every audio story I report. But the digital stories were always different. I tell folks, if you don't think I'm being productive enough, it's because I have to tell every story in two radically different ways. Because what works in audio doesn't work in print. And the beautiful thing about the Sunday Story is I've been telling, my boss here for years, I'm really reluctant to wade into the school choice fight unless I can do the sort of rabbit hole storytelling that I really like and that I think a story this complex really demands and deserves. There are lots of families in Iowa who say school choice was a very good thing for them. And I need to make sure that they are heard, as well as the families and the public school advocates who say, it's ruining public education. I needed to be able to do all of it. And the Sunday Story gave me 30 minutes, which is an incredibly big sandbox for a radio reporter who's used to 4 minutes. So
Nice.
If you really want to hear the story as it's intended, listen to the Sunday Story version, which is 30 minutes. I am planning in the next few days to do a sort of distilled 6 to 7 minute version for one of our news magazines. Although there's just no way. I can't squeeze a camel through the eye of a needle. It's just going to be what it is.
But you will. I know it's hard to do. Not too long ago, Emily Hanford had to turn Sold the Story into a 1 hour reveal. I don't know how she did it. She had to kill a lot of babies to get there, but she did it. And I think a lot more people heard the story. So anyway, I feel your pain, and I hope you get there. And
thank you.
This choice coverage issue is so important. It's easy to do cartoonish school choice coverage. And I've talked to a lot of journalists about how to do an in-depth version. I have not yet heard of another person who's gotten a 30-minute bite at it. And I hope more people follow suit and really dig in and grapple with the story rather than just doing the he said, she said.
I mean, this is the thing, Alexander. Like, it's 2026 journalism. I feel like as the public's attention span, thanks in large part to social media, continues to diminish and their willingness to engage with journalism diminishes, I think it's really important that journalism itself doesn't diminish its own ambitions. And also our own responsibility to the stories that we tell. This is not an easy story. And just because we think people only want to engage with 3, 4, 5 minutes doesn't mean that's all we should give them.
Right. Don't chase social media to the bottom.
No.
Yeah.
No.
It's so interesting. For the record, I need to say that KUOW's school-based podcast series, I think 8 half hours on School Predator in Seattle, is one of the top most listened to series on Apple right now. So it can be done, but it takes bravery and a lot of time.
I mean, let me tell you, like, the dirty little secret about NPR and all those stations out there, those public radio stations, like, I can name you a whole bunch of places all over the country with ed reporters who are doing incredible work. I know many of them. I'm friends with some of them. I respect all of them. Like, yeah, we're doing the work. It's out there.
It definitely is. Jess Clark's The Girls this winter was amazing. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but those are the two that come to mind.
Lots of respect for Jess.
So let's talk about what we're here to talk about today, which is a little bit sort of a history project, looking back at a policy that had a heyday and got a lot of coverage, and now is no longer enjoying a heyday. For people who might not know, how would you summarize this what I call student debt relief initiative?
I mean, I guess the simplest way to map it, if we're talking specifically about the sort of singular effort by the Biden administration to forgive some or all of the federal student loan debt of most federal student loan borrowers. It was a campaign pledge he made when he was running for president. And for lots of different reasons, it took him a while to field an actual proposal. And then I remember he came out and proposed it in August of 2022. I was at the beach. I was on vacation, and so I broke out of my vacation mode to cover this thing, and it was, it was interesting, Alexander, because it was incredibly generous, and also I think from the get-go, it was pretty clear that the legal justification was tenuous. It was as tenuous as the plan was generous. So for this podcast, I was actually going back to some of my old stories, and I realized, like, even in those original first few weeks stories, it was raising real questions about, okay, when are the lawsuits going to start?
Right.
The HEROES Act, really? What an interesting use of the HEROES Act, and why not use the Higher Education Act? And then, you realize behind the scenes, like, well, it's because they didn't think it would work. So there it was. The promise, the pitch didn't last very long because there were sort of a rash of lawsuits that ended up being filed by state attorneys generals representing largely Republican controlled states. And they argued from one court to the next that Biden had clearly exceeded his authority to use the executive branch to enact a policy that would have been incredibly expensive. And it was clear as a policy, if Congress had wanted to do this, it would have done it.
Right.
And they didn't.
Right.
So that's I don't know if that was short, but that was the short-ish version.
Right. There were previous versions of debt relief for public service employees,
Yep.
and the idea of it, or the concept of it, had been out there, but then it gets supercharged as a big whopping political promise during Biden. I remember your stories and others were clear from the start about the legal challenges. Right. That was clear from the start. And it was also clear that this was intended as that there was a healthy political aspect of it. This is a popular, let's give money to people. They'll like getting relief from it. The thing that wasn't clear to me at the time, and I'm curious about your reflection, is that it might be politically unpopular. Because in the last year or two, I haven't seen anyone say that debt relief was the thing that cost the Democrats the election. But I have seen a lot of people saying, "Hey, this was really misguided politically," and I'm curious whether it was whether that seems like a reasonable claim to make, that a program aimed at middle or upper middle class college goers was going to be popular. And then, were you aware that there might be backlashing effect?
Yes. So I just found this. Yeah, here it is. I'm just looking at my computer. Now I'm trying to find you on my screen again. Okay. Yeah. So I went back to my coverage because, we're talking in hindsight now. I remember thinking the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so 2 months before Biden officially announced this debt relief proposal, I wrote a story on an Ipsos poll that we did asking
Right.
folks, do you support federal student loan relief? And we offered a few options. And then we did this really interesting thing that for me, and you can see it in the story, was super telling, which is more important?
Right.
Erasing the loans, some or all, I forget how we put it, some or all student loan debt for
Right.
current borrowers, or reining in the costs of college.
Right.
And it wasn't even close. Reining in the costs of college, a meaningful, lasting approach to the problem,
Right.
won hands down.
Right.
And for me, that was a really interesting tell.
And were you able to write the story and include that as things went forward?
I
Because
mean,
because that's the kind of context. I talk about this with school shooting coverage or with COVID coverage back when we were talking about that. That kind of context, which I'm going to paraphrase as, oh, by the way, this is not the most popular thing that they could be doing. My school shooting version is, oh, by the way, you're just as likely to be hit and hurt by a car on the way to school. That kind of context sometimes gets lost. And I'm curious about your experience. It sounds like you got it right at the start. This is not the Santa Claus that people want for higher ed. Were you able to sort of keep that context alive, or were people talking about it more than I may remember?
That's a great question. It's so yes, I remember referencing the polling in, if I would do a radio hit. I didn't do it every time, and I didn't include it in every digital story, but I remember referencing polling, the polling specifically, but definitely more often using this idea when talking in the broader context of debt relief, saying very clearly, repeatedly, this doesn't address the problem at all.
Right.
In fact, I can't remember which show it was, which hit it was, but I remember saying very clearly, like, this does nothing, or would do nothing, for the student who takes out a student loan next month. And that's a powerful problem, and a limitation of a policy that would have cost, depending on the analysis you use, between $200 and $400 billion, right? Like, if you're not fixing the problem, you're just addressing the sort of historic symptoms,
right?
And
talk about putting.
It's just worth acknowledging, like, it's not a fix. I remember saying that very clearly. I can't remember. I think maybe to Steve Inskeep on Morning Edition once. I was like, this isn't a fix. This will help historic borrowers, but it changes nothing.
Right.
And for me, that was always a real shortcoming.
Right.
Of the policy.
And talk about putting the government on the hook, right? Once you institute this policy, and people get used to it, then in theory you have to do it going forward, and all of a sudden you've got billions and billions adding up. Did you feel like did you get pushback for including this, for warning people that this wasn't unicorns and rainbows? Did the Biden people send you hate mail? What was the response? What was the response to this?
I get hate mail from everybody, so it's just part of the job.
Did you get extra stamps on the hate mail from the Biden people, or I've forgotten, frankly, who else was pushing this outside of the Biden administration? But was there a pushback against including this? Was this considered unwarranted or unfair accusation?
I mean, here's the thing, Alexander. Like, I would like to think, and this is going to sound really naive of me, but I really believe it, And I think the school choice work I just did and what I've heard from all of the sources I used for that story, like I would like to think that when I'm using political sources, that just about everybody I work with, even though there might be stuff in the story they don't like, they know I'm fair, right? So like, again, looking back at my student loan stories, one thing that pops up over and over again, which I remember at the time, I had I had Virginia Fox's staff on speed dial because she was a font of incredible critical quotes about debt relief. I
Right.
mean, you read some of her quotes and they are just incendiary.
Yeah.
And I made a point, if I'm going to spend time on the radio and time in print explaining Biden's proposal and explaining who it would help, it was incumbent upon me,
Yeah.
whether I'm including polling that says, well, it's not as popular as fixing the problem, or, a quote from Virginia Fox saying, this is financially irresponsible and unsustainable.
Right.
Like that's just part of the journalism. You got to do that.
Where does the story fit in the pantheon or the spectrum of stories that you've? It seemed like you were writing about it a lot. I didn't not go back and count how many stories or hits there were. It's not really important. But what's your sense memory of how big a story this was compared to other education stories that you might have done? Was this the big mountain for you, or was this one of several?
No. Mm-mm. So the reason I said yes to this invitation,
Yeah,
is because I remember talking at the time with colleagues about how I'm thinking about this, and there was just such an onslaught of ideas around debt relief at the time that the distinctions in my choices as a reporter and the stories that I chose, I think the distinctions were lost on most people. But I really wanted a chance to explain, like, because people forget how much was happening all at once.
okay.
So I would say a big chunk of my debt relief coverage at the time actually had nothing to do with the Biden proposal. So I covered it when he announced it,
Right.
and I covered the legal challenges. I did a whole story. It was so nerdy. I just reread it. It's like, oh, I can't believe I went down that rabbit hole. Holy cow! Talking about standing but a whole story on Republican arguments against the plan and why they think their arguments are going to win in court. But a huge chunk of my debt relief reporting was actually focused entirely elsewhere. And here's the distinction that is super important to me. And back when I was on social media, I'm not anymore, but back when I was on social media, I tried to make this point.
Okay.
And that is, I was focused on, one, public service loan forgiveness.
Right.
And two, I did a big investigation right around the same time that Biden made his proposal. I did a big investigation using documents that were leaked to me from the Ed Department into the absolute catastrophe that was income-driven repayment.
Right.
And for me, these two programs, IDR and public service loan forgiveness, these are promises made by the government, made by Congress. PSLF was 2007. May have been a Democratic Congress. President George W. Bush signed it. IDR, similar.
Right.
These are promises to borrowers, and they did not work. And they didn't work. It wasn't even close. It was bad. And they were actively hurting borrowers. And so I spilled a ton of ink and used a ton of airtime investigating both programs. And ultimately, the Biden administration agreed on both programs to make pretty seismic changes. And I covered those.
Well,
and that's because I think those changes were necessary and important, and I would like to think they're nonpartisan. Just like my very first loan investigation I did during the first Trump administration into the Teach Grant program, which was also an absolute disaster. And yet it was the Trump administration that actually had the courage to go on the record with me, with my microphone, and apologize, even though they didn't make the problem. It wasn't their problem, but they agreed to fix it, and they apologized. And I see PSLF and the IDR stuff as the same. Like, these problems lasted through administrations, and somebody needed to own them and fix them. And that's what happened. And I think a lot of people, they saw my coverage of IDR and the investigations and then the fixes that were leading to debt relief for hundreds of thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
And they were thinking, oh, this must be part of the Biden plan.
Mm.
And it was totally separate.
Totally
Separate.
Did the problems with the income driven and the public service, did they shape or hinder the development or the implementation to the extent that it happened, the debt relief, or did the fixes during Trump help convince the Biden people that they should do this? What's the relationship between the two?
I mean, PSLF was kind of a no-brainer. It was passed in 2007, so you should have started seeing a sort of first class of folks, 2017, 2018, 2019, qualifying for relief, and like no one was getting through. And it was kind of intertwined with the IDR problems. The Ed Department at the time and servicers, they just weren't singing from the same hymnal, and they were just regularly giving borrowers terrible advice, having borrowers who wanted PSLF, putting them in payment plans that didn't qualify. So you had borrowers who were teachers and nurses, working 6-7 years, making payments, and then being told like, oh yeah, no, you got to start over.
Right.
I mean, it's just, I think to your question about how this overlapped or intersected with the big student loan relief proposal, I mean, like, technically it didn't at all.
Right.
But for me, it kind of muddied the water because my focus with PSLF and income-driven repayment was fixing programs that Congress had agreed to. And they both included debt relief, right? You put in X amount of time and you get debt relief. Right. There was an agreement. And so those fixes were about keeping promises. And the only real promise with the Biden debt relief program really was the promises that he made on the campaign trail. Right. And there was nothing Congress had done or said to make that commitment. He went out on a limb. And ultimately the courts decided like, you don't have any business going out that far. But I do think it muddied the water. It muddied the conversation. It put debt relief. It was kind of omnipresent. And I remember actually, there was appetite at NPR to do maybe more coverage of the proposal itself. Mm-hmm. And, what I often said was, I'm going to focus on these other things that were commitments. Mm-hmm. They're legal. And keeping the promises is a legal requirement. And I'm going to focus more on accountability journalism than I am on covering this thing over here that no one's quite certain about. I did cover it.
Right.
I covered it pretty thoroughly. But going back and looking, I actually keep a list of every story I ever did. Right. And I was looking back at my list and I don't think I overdid the proposal. I'd like to think I kept it in its lane.
Is there room, looking back, and I appreciate you looking back and how impressive that you keep a list, is there room still today in 2026 for reiterating or clarifying the separation between these pre-existing programs and promises and this campaign-driven new kid on the block? Or are there any other reflections? A lot of what I do talking to journalists is ask them to reflect on their work. Are there any other things that you, given the chance, would go back and do or do differently or wouldn't do that came to mind when you look back at the list?
It's a great question. I think I think one of the things that I still grapple with is sort of holding multiple truths in my hands at once and helping
Right.
listeners and readers do the same. I understand, going back to that very first Ipsos poll, right? Americans are much more interested in like resolving the original sin, the problem itself, than they are in sort of broad debt relief. Um, and that actually makes a lot of sense to me. But the multiple truths are, you still have to keep in mind that there are millions of borrowers who, especially the legacy borrowers, who got pulled into the system. And for a really long time, the system sucked.
Yeah.
It just wasn't good. It wasn't well built. It wasn't well designed. It was poorly executed by the education department of multiple administrations.
Super demoralizing. My ex was in it, and it was a nightmare.
Yeah. And also, like, it's so easy to vilify the servicers, but like they're only as good as the sort of input and guidance they're getting from the department. Right? Like they get paid to do a job, and they don't actually get paid very much to do an incredibly difficult job. And I don't mean to make excuses for them, because obviously there have been servicers who have absolutely failed. And that was part of my income-driven repayment stories. Holy cow. Talk about mismanagement. But like the system was bad, and it hurt a lot of people. And so like I do get a little tired of the overly politicized rhetoric today, where like borrowers who were hurt don't even want to talk publicly anymore, because the public's like, oh, boo hoo. And, like it can be true that the system sucked and someone got hurt. And it's like, set them back.
Right.
And also that, okay, you didn't go to college, and you didn't feel like you could borrow this money, and you like, it's both true.
Right.
So, I don't know. I'm not making a lot of sense here. I guess yeah.
Well, you're bringing up this issue of complexity, both as a reporter and as a presenter of information to the public, and this constant temptation. If I understand you correctly, the temptation of social media, of politics, of the world, to surfacize and simplify things when they're much deeper than that.
They're much deeper than that. Yeah. I mean, right now we're getting into this really interesting moment where the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is really going to start putting the screws to colleges and universities in an interesting way. And I am very curious to see what happens, because in a sense, what this is going to do is kind of what that Ipsos poll was getting at many years ago around, would you rather try to fix the problem? Now, I don't know that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is going to come anywhere close to doing that. It might just make a mess even worse, even messier. I don't know. I'm very curious.
Is this the gainful employment thing I read?
Yeah, it's basically gainful employment extrapolated to all colleges and universities.
Wow.
And sorry, I realize I'm a hand stalker, which is weird in a video, but I can't help it.
I'm Italian. I'm used to it. It's fine.
I'm a radio guy, so normally, like, it doesn't matter.
Thank you so much for talking and reflecting. I really appreciate it. People are going to find this enormously useful to hear what you did and how you think about it. One last question is, are there any lessons from, and this may be too much of a stretch, but I have to ask, are there any lessons from the debt relief stories and the stories related that you talked about? Are there any lessons from that coverage that you did for the school choice moment that's happening? Are there any things that you were like, okay, I want to not do that, or I want to do something again that I did that was really helpful and effective?
I mean, it's a thoughtful question. I want to give a thoughtful answer. I will say that the very first thing that comes to mind is also super interesting to me. It's the tax credit scholarship that I mentioned at the beginning that Republicans included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And I only bring that up to say, that's how laws work, and you can't, like, I am covering it from a sort of open-minded, okay, you guys voted for it, you created it, it's real and it's legal. So it in a sense, like, they bypassed the whole shebang that brought down Biden's debt relief proposal because they put it in the law.
Right. They got it through Congress. They didn't try to do it through a resolution.
They didn't try to do it through executive authority. Now, I will say, interestingly, the whole argument against debt relief and this even goes back to the Obama administration. There have been lots of criticism of Democratic presidents by Republicans for getting way out over their skis in how they use executive authority. But, I think we see the Trump administration doing this constantly. And so in that sense, I have been using the same sort of litmus test for Biden debt relief that I have for, an executive order purporting to close the education department, when we all know the education department was created by Congress and the sub-offices of the department were created by Congress. And if you look back at that statute, it specifically says this and this and this have to be done through the department. So, the argument about executive overreach, it goes both ways. And, it's just 2026, so I'm talking about the Trump administration.
The connection that comes to my mind is arguably poorly targeted initiative and a big financial cost being promised to someone. Are those connections valid at all?
For debt relief?
Between debt relief and private school choice in the big bill.
Poorly targeted. I don't know. I'm curious to see how the tax credit scholarship works. I think it will be interesting to do the math on how much money the U.S. government ends up foregoing in tax breaks, because the tax break is incredibly generous. Right. That said, I think the school choice conversation is fascinating because, as I saw in Cedar Rapids, and you can see it state by state right now, like, there's not one way to do it. There are actually more and less thoughtful ways of rolling out, let's say, a private school voucher or an education savings account program. I mean, and specifically the big sticking point or red flag in my Cedar Rapids reporting was, what in the world is supposed to happen for students with disabilities? There's no safeguard here.
Right.
But we've seen a handful of other states at least try to make a good faith effort, or at least an effort to mitigate those effects. I'm not saying they work. Right. I haven't looked at those programs closely enough to know. But I think for as long as students with disabilities only really have federal protections, federal education protections in public schools, we're going to have a problem.
Is it too soon for you to tell us what state you're going to next, or are you through traveling for a little while now?
Too soon.
Too soon.
I've got a couple ideas on my list, but I try to shake things up, and I've done school choice. It won't be another school choice story for a while.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughtfulness. Cory Turner from NPR's education team, much appreciated.
Thank you, Alexander.